What I realized as I got older was it was the psychological warfare that he played with the young kid's mind. So when you're young, your mind's like a sponge. And when your dad's telling you all these things about who you're not, you grow up to be this, you grow up to be that, you're not this, you're not that, that's who you become. And when this is happening on a daily basis, because this guy's insecure about his own life and what's going on, so that was my foundation in Buffalo until I was about 8 years old.
Yeah.
Had a learning disability, stuttered really bad, white splashes on my skin, hair falling out. So when you have a bad foundation, learning disability, all you want to do is hide out. So I created this other person who was a fake person. The real me was afraid of fucking everything. So that was my foundation growing up. I had to literally, so we get scarred. And the thing about it is, like, if you were in the kitchen and you're cutting up cucumbers, you cut your finger. It happened 30 years ago. That scar is still there. They say, what happened to your finger? Guess what you do? I was in the kitchen one day, I was cutting up cucumbers. You have those scars in your fucking brain from life. But what we don't do is we try to hide those scars. We don't want to go back and revisit it. Mm-hmm. It's not as simple as a cucumber, cutting a cucumber. Mm-hmm. So I started realizing that my life was causing a whole bunch of scarring on my brain. And I had to go back, while I wrote this book, I had to go back and really break open that scar and let it bleed. And that was a very painful journey for me to go back, because right now this is all surface. Learning disability, it's all surface. I'm the only person in the history of the military who has ever gone through Air Force Tactical Air Control Party training, Army Ranger School as an Army man in 3 hell weeks. So only person to ever do that. But the reason why I did it was, when I was a young kid, I considered myself very weak. And as I started developing this indestructible mental toolbox, because what I realized was the things I was most afraid of, I cowered from. I had to start facing these things and becoming an expert at the things I feared the most. I was afraid of my own mind. My mind would get off on these crazy places of woe is me. My internal conversation wasn't great, so I had to start mastering it. Once I started mastering it, in the horrible place I was at, I considered myself the worst person ever alive. That was my conversation. But once I started mastering my own life, I started realizing, my God, man, this was in me. I was a 300-pound fat guy. Now I'm 181 pounds, 190 pounds, whatever it was. I'm gonna go through all these hell weeks. So I started realizing the capabilities of the human soul and the human mind. I started to examine it more and more. So we have a theorist, and we have a practitioner. The theorist is a person that's gonna sit back and read books from a library that someone else wrote. They become real smart about what someone else wrote, okay? A practitioner is me. I put myself in hell, lived in it for a long time, and figured out how the human mind works while suffering, while in pain, while in misery. And that's how I wrote my book. I'm gonna tell you exactly what your mind is thinking. Most of us don't stay in hell long enough to write the book. I stayed in long enough to write it and finish the book. You have to make a list of the things that you don't like to do. This list should be very long. Like, if you don't like making calls, the very first thing you should do is start making a shit ton of fucking calls. Because why? That begins to own you. You start to drive yourself this way versus this way. But you'll figure out, if you start making a whole bunch of fucking calls, if you like calling, call a lot. Guess what happens? You get over it. So what we do a lot is, I heard a lot of people say, triple down on this, triple down on most of your strength. No. That works for a lot of things, but when you're afraid and you don't have the courage, you have to triple down on your weaknesses and make that become where you start to guide yourself. Okay, I don't like calling. Today I'm making 100 calls. I'm gonna dial 100 times. What happens is, when I was younger, life and society made this big world with all these endless fucking possibilities. Endless possibilities. My life made my possibilities this fucking big, because it made me afraid of all these different things. So all this stuff trapped my mind, it shackled my brain, it made me a prisoner within my own self, saying, this is all I can do. Because why? I'm afraid of this, I'm insecure over here, I got self-doubt over here, that behind me, good Lord, who knows what's behind me? I'm not gonna look behind me. So your life is this big. Versus it being like, I can do all this shit out here, if I start to break down these different walls and barriers. And that's what I started realizing. I could become a Navy SEAL. I could become this, but I was afraid of the water. Think about this. Why the fuck are you gonna go be a Navy SEAL when all you do is play in the water? And we don't play, we're in it and we're living in it. The ocean is unforgiving. Yep. I'm gonna go be a Navy SEAL. Yeah. If I didn't face that fear, no one would ever know me. I was number 3 behind Michelle Obama for a long time until my book sold out. And I was a guy just 21 years ago who was 300 pounds, could barely read and write, and now I have a book just 2 spots behind Michelle Obama, just because I was afraid. Yeah. But you overcome those fears, guess what happens? The whole world, you unlock this door and everything opens back up again.
I think you can make that case about self-consciousness in people. I mean, self-consciousness as a trait loads on neuroticism. So, and when people say I became self-conscious, they usually mean they've become embarrassed or anxious, right? And those things do overlap to a tremendous degree. So self-consciousness per se as an experienced phenomenon is associated with negative emotion. Well, but do you want to dispense with it? Well, no, because it's really informative, but you don't want to experience it. So if you're made self-conscious by one of your inadequacies, you want to remove the inadequacy, you don't want to remove the self-consciousness. But it can get out of hand too. People can be so self-conscious and so self-critical that they can't move forward. So it can definitely be, you can have too much of that, that's for sure. And it's one of the things you do as a behavior therapist, again, a cognitive behavior therapist, is if you have someone who's particularly self-conscious, there'll be a litany in their head of all of their inadequacies. And so it's like they have an inner tormentor that just constantly natters at them about how useless and weak and inadequate they are. And there's a lot of stock arguments that repeat. And one of the things you do with someone who is in that situation is you have them write down all their self-critical thoughts, and you do that dialectically. You help them over many sessions make a complete account, and then you help them develop counter-arguments. Not false counter-arguments, but you go after it. It's like, well, is that really true? And here's the evidence that it's not. And so you can bolster people against the consequences of self-consciousness gone amok. And that's often quite effective. It's probably, at least in part, the inevitable consequence of being a creature who's continually being socially evaluated. So you have a voice inside that's something like the abstracted average of everyone's criticism of everyone. And that's useful because it reminds you not to do things that other people are going to object to. It also, assuming your culture is reasonably functional, it also reminds you not to do things that are going to be counterproductive. And so that's one source. It's like interiorized public opinion. And then other sources are, well, it's also the voice of your ideals. And that in that sense, you might consider it your conscience. And that can be, well, that's extraordinarily useful because it points out your shortcomings. Now, one of the things, analyze the movie Pinocchio, sort of ad nauseum, I would say, but it's been very useful to me. One of the things that's so remarkable about that movie is that the voice of the conscience, which is portrayed by Jiminy Cricket, is symbolically associated with Jesus Christ in the movie. But interestingly enough, there's a dialectical relationship between the puppet, the wooden-headed puppet whose strings are being pulled by external forces, and the conscience. So despite the voice of the conscience being symbolically associated with Christ, the conscience has something to learn during the journey as well. And so there's like a dialogue between the conscience and the developing individual, and the consequence of the dialogue is the conscience gets more effective as the person becomes more developed. And I think that's right, because imagine that you have the average ideal inside you speaking to you, and you have the the average social voice inside you speaking to you. But it isn't really speaking to you. It isn't taking your particularities into account. And it isn't until you engage with your conscience that you can craft it into something that's actually speaking specifically to you.